Welcome to Inaudible. I'm your host, Jeremy Weiland, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ryan Masterson. On this podcast, we discuss the weird, beautiful channeled messages found in the long tradition of Confederation channeling, philosophy, and seeking, articulating a philosophy of spiritual evolution known as the Law of One. Many of these messages are available to listen to on our sister podcast, Living, Love, and Light, available on all platforms. We seek to provide analysis and commentary on this Law of One philosophy described in these messages, identifying the common themes and grappling with the application of this information to our human lives. However, we are not counselors, gurus, or experts of any kind, so please evaluate our words in light of our shortcomings and use your own best judgment. Hey, Ryan, how's it going?
Hey, Jeremy. I like that intro.
Yeah.
Subtly different, but I like it.
You know, it's something that my wife had been suggesting for us to, mention that although we talk about the kinds of human issues that come up in life and how to deal with it, we are not the only source of help. And it's important that people recognize that there are other places to go for help and that it's perfectly normal to do so.
Yeah. This is just one way of looking at the world.
Yeah. I think there's some word salad in there that I could clean up now that I'm looking at it. But
I enjoy when you note that we are not gurus. And in the financial industry, there's a funny notion that the word why we use in finance the term guru is because charlatan is too hard to spell. So I appreciate that note.
Are you thinking of Jim Cramer with FTX in particular here?
I am thinking of a lot of people. The moment someone says there is a secret inside the financial industry, or this even goes with personal training, there's a secret inside the fitness industry. Whenever someone tells you about a secret, you know they're full of crap. They are definitely full of crap. But I really enjoy that. But I think of now guru is used in India. You know, it is a legitimate term for a personal spiritual leader, right? Mm-hmm. It may have more context than that. That's just how I understand it. So it's a legitimate term without that negative connotation. But in regards to New Age spiritual thought, there are a lot of gurus with quotes around it. But again, charlatans are too hard to spell. I think it's a negative way at looking at things, but I do think it's funny.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, the reason that you have to wonder about financial folks is that do they have a vested interest in having you believe something, right?
Yes.
So I do have a vested interest in the listener believing what we're saying, but not quite to the same degree and not quite for the same reasons. I want feedback. I want to know, hey, are we helping or not? I don't need to know, did you do what I say or did you do what Kuo says or anything like that,
Did you buy my product?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, that's a big one. So no, definitely. Yeah. I too have a vested interest in this because this helps me. By our chats, these help me navigate things I'm going through, things you're going through, and this exercise has immense value for me personally.
Absolutely. And speaking of the guru thing, there have been a lot of sessions I've read at the end of the archive read through, which I completed a couple of weeks ago.
Congrats.
At least through Carla's tenure. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of people who approach spirituality in terms of, I do need a guru to help me, to sort of like carry the torch for me. And in the Eastern traditions, that tends to be a lot more prevalent. That there's a relationship that develops between the student and the guru where they don't give up on each other. They're almost kind of like spiritually married. And they make an unbreakable pact together.
Interesting.
It's not like that. There was a session that talked about that. I forget what it was. But Kuo said that in the Western traditions, we have figures like Jesus that are kind of more universal gurus, right? So you place your faith in Jesus. You don't place your faith in a different particular person.
Yes.
And so that has disadvantages because you can translate this Jesus however you want, right? But the guru thing also has disadvantages too because, there's honestly and sadly been stories of abuse that gurus have put students through or have engaged in, and that's part of the thing going on here. So
people gonna people. People are gonna be people.
I mean, we have our megachurch preachers and scandals, so we have our own version of that. It's not absent from Christianity whatsoever.
Certainly.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the darker side of things and the negative side of things, that's kind of the topic for today. Normally, I try to stay away from the entire concept of negative greeting, or the way that in Confederation works. They discuss entities outside the self, largely from higher densities, who have a interest themselves in our lives, in using the material of our lives, our catalyst, to give us opportunities to choose service to self instead of service to others. I try to stay away from that because I find that it often is an excuse for people to explain away their own lessons and flaws. Like if I'm in pain because of something outside of myself, then I don't have to take responsibility for it. And that's not the message of the law of one at the root. The message of the law of one at the root is that these negative encounters reflect something that's already inside of us, that's part of us. And that if we are being greeted, or if a distortion of ours is being energized, well, it's being energized from without, yes, but it's still our distortion. Yes. And it's still there, that we have all of the agency to work with it and refine it and use it for learning, even if it's a tough situation, right?
Well, how do you recognize it? I mean, can you recognize it?
That's kind of what I've been wrestling with lately, because, as we were talking about before we started recording, Claire and Jade left the channeling circle. And I feel like some of the circumstances around that, I can't say for sure, but it had the tinge of negativity, because it seemed like perceptions were manipulated so subtly to really put us in opposition, where there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to see eye to eye on these things. And these things happen. Like, I still have an immense amount of respect and love for Jade and Claire, but I just, I have to wonder about the way that this fell apart and how to reckon with that. It certainly had tons and tons and tons to do with my own distortions. There's no doubt about that. But it's not the distortions that give me the indication of an encounter with the negative. It's the way that they were all subtly positioned against each other, just oriented enough so that we couldn't understand each other. And that's what it was. It was a lot of confusion, a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of the perceptions and expectations that just never got accounted for, that suddenly came up.
Well, I'm thinking of, like, in my own in my personal life, it's when I experience something like this, there's that kind of, you said, that initial shift of people's perceptions and understandings of one another that essentially moves you into conflict mode. And then once you're in conflict mode, there's call it a pressure that is dampening your ability to reach understanding with someone. Sometimes you feel like it's just straight up coming from the other person, but sometimes you also recognize that it's you. Like, it's like, boy, I'm trying here, but I do not understand where the hell you are coming. Like, you are crazy. I feel like that sometimes at work with some coworkers that can be particularly challenging. But usually I can work through it, but at least I can recognize that in myself when I'm starting to struggle with that next step of trying to understand where someone else is coming from. But it's funny. Sometimes I cannot figure it out. It's at some point there's just a level of faith that I have to give another person to be like, I think they're doing their best. And I'm just, and I think they're not out to get me. So I'm just going to let this one roll and then, try to move on to the next. I guess to the next conflict we'll inevitably get to, because we're all different people. So
yeah, it's always a learning opportunity for the self, and I've learned a great deal about myself through all this. But But it's still, since it was something that I encountered in my life, and even though I'm resistant to the language of negative psychic greeting and all that, it seemed so unmistakable to me that I thought it'd be worth looking into a Kuo session that dealt with this. And the one that I found was, good Lord, it's almost like 13 years ago exactly, December 5th, 2009. This is a practice channeling circle for a few new channels for LL at the time, including, I believe, Steve Tyman and some others. So they're showing up at the end of the transcript read through. So that's
Nice.
why a lot of these practice circles are coming up. But since they have a variety of instruments with different perspectives, I thought it'd be good to look at this one.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So, yeah. All right. So let's jump right in. The question spoken by Jim here is, as we seek to know ourselves and know the truth on this journey, there frequently occurs for the seeker an oppositional force, either an entity or an essence that is of a negative nature. We are wondering how Kuo would suggest that we attempt to understand this negativity, whether an essence or an entity, and how to address it, how to approach it, how to respond to it. So even the way that they state this question, it leaves a lot of room for the self to take responsibility. It leaves a lot of room for us to focus on how we perceive it, and not so much putting emphasis on the fact that an encounter is occurring in the first place. Since we live in a psychically, metaphysically diverse universe, we should expect that we are encountering all kinds of forces of all kinds of polarities at all times. There are some rules about the quarantine that Ra gives, that there's only a certain amount of negative influx that's allowed from, say, the so-called Orions. But at the same time, there is some negative influx allowed, because if there's going to be positive influx, if there's going to be positive support for service to others polarization from the Confederation, there needs to be balance from another side so that we can make a free choice. The point is not to go one way or the other, but to go one of the ways, and for it to be our choice that it happens, right? That's how polarization actually expresses our power, instead of just, molding it.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump right in. Kuo says, "You ask this evening, my friends, about those experiences of resistance or opposition or disturbance that seem to sometimes stand in front of one on a path of seeking and say, 'Go no further.' The nature of your query is unique in our experience, in that each of those within this circle is dealing with a spiritual path which has great depth. For many who are beginners upon the path of seeking, there is not seen the vertical aspect of seeking, but the horizontal, if we may use that figure. This is a weird metaphor, but stick with it. I'd like to at least touch upon it." So they continue. "It does not hold precisely, but it works, inasmuch as we may say that it is possible to pursue a path of seeking that is seen as a journey from point A to point B to point C, and so forth, as though it were walking across firm ground or riding across the level of the sea in a horizontal manner. To those we would answer in one way. This evening, however, we feel we are speaking with those who are experiencing the collapsing of boundaries, and at the same time the releasing of boundaries, so that in one way it seems that all levels of the creation have come together in one focus, and in other ways it seems that all of the levels of creation are spreading themselves like peacock's tails to express in more and more detail the unbelievable nuances possible, and the great variety of points of awareness which are held in simultaneous fashion in one fragile instrument of the Creator such as each of you is." This is probably the best place to stop. So they're talking about this horizontal way of understanding or expressing our path versus a vertical way. I don't think it's necessary to put too much emphasis or nuance on this, but there are deeper and deeper levels upon which these spiritual questions can be answered. There is the straight ahead one, which I think they mean the horizontal one, which would be kind of like, basic operating guidance for dealing with negative feelings and just dealing with the surface of these things. But on the spiritual path, on the adept's path, we try to not just overcome these obstacles, these distractions and disturbances, but we try to understand them and use them as mechanisms for self-understanding and for understanding the Creator. And that opens up a lot of nuance in how to understand these things. Because if we do not fear these events that are not pleasant, but instead really want to use them, really want to open up to them and feel them, even if they're painful, even if they're not pleasant, then we engage in a different kind of seeking with that catalyst. And all of this is always available to us. All catalyst has this depth to it. We can always choose to lock into it.
It is a different journey. I do like this analogy of moving horizontally versus vertically, because everyone moves horizontally. There's almost no choice. It's without choice do we move horizontally. We get over the speed bumps of life. We get through the challenges somehow. That vertical journey to me speaks of that growth that occurs, perhaps actively, or what's the word? It's you're seeking out that growth. You're seeking that vertical journey rather than just passively going through the horizontal journey. So I do like that analogy.
Yeah, there's a metaphor that the Confederation often uses of, things moving in a cycle. Mm-hmm. And they I'm going to paraphrase, but they basically often say, from your point of view, it often looks like you keep repeating these issues in your life, right? Mm-hmm. You keep cycling. But that's only on one two-dimensional plane. If you could see it three-dimensionally, it would look more like a spiral, right? So that as you circle these issues and go over them in more and more depth, you are moving deeper into them. You are moving on a straight line, but you're using a circle to get you there. So you're spiraling towards unity. And that's often how they talk about the light, right? It's a spiral, it's upward spiraling light. So from our point of view, it often seems repetitive and redundant, but we're actually, each time we encounter a lesson, we are encountering it with a slightly different self that has been molded and shaped by past experience and the work that we've done.
Yes.
So that's how I understand it. Hopefully that gives people a way to instrumentalize the metaphor. Anyway. And I like the way that they talk about the collapsing of boundaries and the releasing of boundaries, right? So you're trying to transcend these concepts that normally delineate what's good, what's bad, where we're on the path, when we're not on the path. And that in doing so, you can see greater detail. And I think it's this detail this energetic detail, like the peacock's feathers expressing themselves in full vibrant color. That's kind of when we get these glimpses of the full majesty of the creation and the Creator. So just to put a cherry on that.
Perfect.
Continuing with Kuo. Thusly, we shall answer in a different way, in a way in which we attempt to help you look at not only what may be opposing, distracting, or offering resistance to you, but also who you are, and what your points of perception may be that cause such and such a limitation, a resistance, or a distraction to surface before your near vision. We speak to those whose hearts are pure, whose intention is set upon the pilgrim's path. We salute you individually and collectively, for you have broken through that which is of the world to see with eyes that look for love, that hope to give love, and that are able to recognize the love that is the heart and soul of every essence and every entity within this creation. So, and that's very much how I think of this podcast, that we're trying to go deeper. We're trying to give you more subtle things to hold on to so that you can have your own understanding and reality of these messages where you're making these connections. We're helping you make the connections, but you could be making completely different connections than we're seeing. And it's often not until you really invest in understanding these messages and first of all, and most importantly, apply it to your life. that you start to get the feedback and you see, okay, well, this concept that they're talking about is sort of has a lot of ambiguity to it because it can mean a lot of different things. Finding the love in the moment. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah.
It's not until you try to do it that you figure out what it is that they might even mean by that.
Yeah, it helps to have these ideas just simmering on your mind.
Exactly.
And much of the time, you're not thinking about it when you go through periods of conflict, periods of strife. But occasionally, these ideas do start to seep in, and the more practice you give them, the more front and center those ideas are,
Yeah.
So.
And it's also important to realize that these are just words. They can't give you the full appreciation of the experience they point at. Only by engaging it with your heart and your mind and your full self can you understand it. And I think that's the mystery of human experience and experience in being separate from the Creator, is to understand that it's only with. And, I often struggle with this because, like we were talking about beforehand, I'm coming out of a, pretty big time of depression personally, struggling with a lot of stuff with the break up the channeling circle and other things going on in my life. And a lot of that involves a kind of pulling away from life, right? A kind of desire not to engage with
withdrawal.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it really just keeps getting worse as long as you try to do that. It doesn't actually get better until you finally decide that you're going to face it. And then you start to feel like you get feedback and progress that you can actually put your feet on. But you have to make the leap of faith that regardless of how busted everything feels, that you're going to continue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing how things turn around when you do that. And it's also amazing that we avoid it for so long.
Yes.
When we know that. I mean, this has happened several times in my life.
But it's so necessary. And I believe that's why templates and ideas like these, like the Law of One or like Christianity or Buddhism, whatever these, again, I call them templates. These are so helpful because that is such a necessary part of life, not just on the horizontal journey, but on that vertical journey. To me, the horizontal journey gets easier as you progress through the vertical journey. And because you have these tools and you have these skills that you've developed over time. So yeah, any ideas that you can lean on to help you get through those challenging times, I think are exceptionally valuable.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's continue. They do an instrument change here. Kuo says, we continue with the theme of that love which you are, and ask you to reflect upon the simple point that all love is an outreaching, and in that capacity shows already the fundamental character of acceptance. So how comes it, you may ask, that experiences arise in which you find yourself confronted with that which is deemed unacceptable, ugly, horrible, and most damaging to one's abiding desire to embrace those around one with an open heart? For it is true that the path of every seeker will find such stumbling blocks. It is true that every seeker finds within himself those experiences which do not smack of love, which are potentially so frightening that one feels it is no longer safe to set foot upon the path of seeking, so that one would find safety and haven in some of the many distractions that offer themselves to one's experience. Whence come these terrors, one asks, and what may one do in the face of them to find a way that permits a continuation along one's path of seeking? As a first step, we suggest that one may examine the question of one's own desire. For desire, my friends, is life, is seeking, is love, and it carries its energies forward into a world of common experience, originally in a quite innocent way. But one's desire often encounters impediments, resistance, and frustration. Okay, so why don't we stop here and take stock?
Yeah, gold. That paragraph says so much, and it reveals so much.
Well, we've talked before about the function of desire in spiritual evolution, how primal it is. On a basic level, it is desire that moves us towards the Creator. It is desire and in the distorted ways in which we understand that desire as we identify at different levels of our own consciousness, that is the thing that's sort of pulling us forward and pulling us into our lessons, our catalysts, and our transformations. So desire is very important, and it's also important to understand that when we have experiences that don't seem to reinforce the goodness of our own desire, that would be very confusing. In other words, why would we, in fact, be pulled into situations through our desire, ostensibly, right, that don't seem to be things we desire, right?
Yes.
Why do we get things we don't seem to desire? This is something we've talked about before on this podcast. If desire is instrumental in everything, then why do we have bad experiences?
Yeah. But I suppose if we didn't, there would be no journey.
Yeah.
Right? That is the journey. But I loved it. Go for it. Keep going.
No, it's just that, the way we've dealt with this conundrum before is to say that we are deeper than our waking selves. And so there's parts of us that desire things that we may not understand completely. And this session is going to get a little more into that idea.
There are parts of us that desire things we don't understand completely. This is fantastic because when I was in my early mid-20s, I was just out of college. I was working as a music teacher. I would run drum programs, and I was writing music and a professional musician. I was trying to figure out my long-term trajectory. And one of my friends had asked me, he asked me outright, he's like, is it that you want to be the best at this thing over here, or that you want to be the best at something? Is it this task in particular that draws you, or is it just the ability to have, a lot of skill in one area in general that is, that was the first flashlight that was ever shined on one of my desires in a way that I'm like, oh, that's a great question. I need to think of that because it wasn't clear to me what my desires were at that time, how focused my desires were, or even my ability to articulate what they were. So
yeah. And a desire can be tangled, right? It can have lots of different things in it. By the time it gets into our waking third density consciousness, it has gone through several layers of biases, distortions, personality aspects. I definitely have been in a position where I wanted to use your situation, I wanted to be good because I wanted to be good at something, not because I wanted to be good at this. And in fact, I think a lot of times work functions as that, right? Like I want to be good at work because I want to keep my job and I want to have security, but not because I really care about the specific thing that I'm doing programming with, right? Like,
yes, for me, along the same lines, it's the desire is not to be a great investment manager or chief investment officer or whatever it is. The desire is to help, is to be that resource that people can go to when they're stressed and they feel like it's all falling apart. And I have the skill set to walk them through that so that they don't really ruin their financial lives. That's the desire. But it's how do you express that desire
and how do you keep everything aligned so that, at the point where you realize, hey, maybe I don't have the skill here and I'm not going to be helpful here. What do I do now,
Finally, at least on this, because this is what immediately comes to mind, is we all might be on a similar path. We even might be side by side, but our desires are so infrequently completely aligned that just naturally means you're going to bump up against one another. And therein lies that inevitable conflict you run into. You're both on the same path. You both have similar desires, but moving together exposes so much because of that inevitable, hitting and rubbing up the friction, as you say.
The more that we can keep that attitude of curiosity and not being appalled by the surprise that consciousness always affords itself through these experiences, right? Like this is this attitude of surprise and taken aback. Like these are actually discoveries of ourselves and the Creator that we should celebrate, but often because they can be unsettling, because they can disturb the balance that we thought we had, right? So we have to be. This is largely what I think the archetype of transformation is all about. It's about recognizing when you're in this liminal position where you're about to be reconfigured in spite of yourself at times, right? Like you're just not in your waking life in charge of all of it.
Yeah.
You're only responsible for accepting it or rejecting it.
Yeah.
And we're going to get into what it means to reject it. That's a lot of what this session centers around.
Okay.
Shall I jump back in?
Let's keep going.
So we were talking about desire and how instrumental it is to seeking. And quote says, but one's desire often encounters impediments, resistance, and frustration. And they continue. And many times these impediments are imposed by expectations on the part of others who one loves and who one feels also return that love. One discovers then that to follow the course suggested by a desire one has would be unacceptable. And therefore one learns from a young age that desire itself can be a risky venture and should never be entered into wholeheartedly or with full fledged. One easily learns to build into the very structure of one's desire a resistance to that desire, which can express in very many different ways. What happens then is that the desire itself is not fully quenched, but rather finds alternative means, secret and subterranean, of expressing the life energy which is already being dedicated in them. This, my friends, is energy of the Creator and is never, never to be despised. And yet so often one finds that that is precisely its fate. It is despised even by the one to whom it most closely belongs. Most who have lived with the kind of experience of third density which you now enjoy are well familiar with this kind of circumstance, and most have had to make accommodation for it in their daily lives in some fashion or another. There are some cases, however, in which the experience of a pocket of a kind of rejected desire or energy is of such a strong nature that it can seem to acquire a life of its own, and can turn on the one whose desire it is into forms that beggar the imagination in terms of range and type of representation. These forms are often dreamlike and can take on proportions that seem to be quite threatening or of a nature alien to the one beset by them. We ask that you recognize first of all, therefore, that all such energy is your own, is the energy of the Creator, is real, and is ultimately capable of being reintegrated. All right, let's stop here. What do you think of that?
That was a lot.
Yeah, it kind of all flowed into each other, but if you'd like, I can sort of summarize it.
Please.
Yeah. So the idea is that we were talking about how desire is this powerful force in our evolution, but that our desire in these passages is not always fully engaged with. I had talked earlier about shrinking from life, shrinking from the things that desire is pushing me towards. Why would I do that? Well, there's certain reasons why I would reject parts of myself and accept other parts of myself. But when we are taught from an early age that not everything we can desire can be had, we learn to, we build in the blockages ourselves. We build in to our own sort of template of seeking, our template of what it means to live a human life, that since we can't have everything we want, there are some things that are bad that we want. And that these things that are bad that we want, this is my understanding.
Sure.
You may have a different understanding, but it seems that we learn that there are some desires that we can't have, and therefore they need to be pushed down. They need to be repressed. This almost gets very Freudian at this point, right?
It totally does, because I remember growing up, my brother and I had a habit of lying to our parents when we were like middle school. And our parents weren't stupid, and they asked, why don't you guys just ask us, like, if you can do this or go to this friend? Like, why don't you just ask us rather than giving us some BS? They said, the worst we can say is no. And in hindsight, that it was not true. The worst thing they did not say was no. In fact, it was the way that they said no made you feel like a complete piece of garbage, just the tone of it. And so this is really speaking to me about having these desires, but not communicating them, pushing them down, not fully leaning into them for whatever reason. But I suppose we all can have things that we want in life that it feels like life is pushing against in an assortment of different ways. And What does that lead to? What does that mean?
Well, what it means in this case is that because they are part of us, even though we reject them, they are part of our creative, propulsive desire. They don't go away. Mm-hmm. They don't simply stop being. In fact, they take on a life of their own at certain times.
They manifest. Remember,
we are what we are dealing with as we grapple with this philosophy, and this is something I think about a lot, is how to be a self that we don't have full access to or control over. We are so much deeper than the personalities we express in this life, even to those we are closest to. We go so much deeper. There are many, many parts of ourselves that we do not have direct access to. Becoming an adept, becoming a person who walks the spiritual path and tries to use life for polarization, that involves, in my view, an attitude towards life that sees it less about getting control and making yourself do things. And it becomes more about seeing your waking self as one part of a whole self. And that evolution is not about like making yourself do stuff. It's about participating in that whole self so that the entire self comes along with your spiritual evolutionary path, instead of parts being left behind because you choose not to identify with them. And then you suddenly think that you're farther ahead than you actually are. But you've got the stuff you've left behind you that you're dragging behind you.
It's called baggage.
Yep. You're right. It's called baggage. Absolutely. Uh-huh. I could have been a lot more succinct. But yeah, it's baggage. And it happens to all of us because, in a way, how could we live our lives coherently as personalities in a third density world if we always were thinking about all the baggage we have? Mm-hmm. We would be depressed. In fact, that's a lot of what I was depressed about, is looking at the baggage that I had mm-hmm. and having to account for it. And I didn't go very far until I had accounted for it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it seems that this baggage has the potential to have a lot more activity to it. Like, because it is part of ourselves, it has the ability to act and have its own life, just as the personalities that we identify with act and have their own life. Mm-hmm. And so this is the nature of where we're going to go with the whole idea of a psychic or negative greeting. Mm-hmm. Is the roots are in ourselves, but they mobilize these energies into seeming actors in our life that we seem to interact with as seemingly other selves. Do you see where we're going here?
Yes, seemingly.
Yeah. All right. Another instrument change. So now we're going to get into integration, right? So we have these parts of ourselves that we've rejected, that seem separate, and that manifest as separate and confuse us by this separation. So now the issue is integration. How do we reclaim this whole self? And Kuo says, the practice of reintegrating that which is perceived as outer with that which you perceive as inner is one of the fundamental practices of the seeker along the path back to oneness with the Creator. That which is perceived as inner and that which is perceived as outer, on the one hand, are very, very real. The monsters in the night exist. They exist because you interact with them. They exist because they give to the perceiver a presence of tangibility. You see them with the eyes of your body or the eyes of your mind, and therefore they take on a reality in your life. On the other hand, these monsters of the night are merely empty perceptions of the mind, holding no real form or ultimate reality. It is only their impact that becomes real.
It is only their impact that becomes real. And the word perceive is sprinkled throughout that paragraph. So it's incredible. It's just an incredible idea that our perceptions are these flimsy, somewhat pliable, but real in the way that their impact is felt. You know, I like this paragraph.
Absolutely. Well, one way of talking about that impact is to say that it has catalyst involved in it, right? Like it has this consequence that bears upon our life in some way that's spiritually relevant to the lessons we're learning. The other thing to point out is that the perception occurs in this depth because we have rejected it and therefore made it an other. And because it's an other, it is perceivable. It's an object and we're the subject viewing it, right? Like we have this duality that we have created. It is a way, so one way of thinking about this is that this is a way in which we finally do integrate with those parts that we've rejected. They first appear as outside the self, as other than the self. We start to realize that they actually are the self, and then we engage in a long process of integrating that, finding a way to see the love in it and to see the self in it.
It's such an interesting point.
Yeah, they can, and I think this perception is tied very much to the creative nature that we possess as parts of the Creator. I think that's what a lot of what the argument they're making is that we see it as simply observing something, but that observation is premised on a fundamental creative act we have taken on our own, whether we are aware of it or not. That creative act being, that's not me.
That is a very wordy but also eloquent way of putting that.
You can't have it both ways. It's wordy.
Well, but it's clear. Maybe clear is the word that I'm looking for. It's clear. Just the act of recognizing something or perceiving something, there's a story involved with that perception. There's something you have to tell yourself about that which you are perceiving.
Bingo. We then have to make it real by the way we perceive it. Mm-hmm. And we also have created the very dichotomy that premises the entire encounter, right? Like that was a creative act we took ostensibly in the past that is now conditioning our present. Mm-hmm. And so we have to wrestle with the reasons that we did that, since we are at the end of the day responsible for it. Let's continue with this creative perception idea. So Kuo says, you perceive yourself as real. Each of those in this circle of seeking sees him or herself as an I with a mind and individuality. And when you perceive a self, it is then easy to perceive an other self. You each hold an identity of self and claim those things which you believe belong to the self, the traits of your being, that composite of thoughts and memories and mannerisms that form the being that you call yourself. Those things which you do not wish to integrate into that perception of self are often ignored or rejected. It is as if you choose those things which you will make yourself, and those things which you will choose to make an other self and reject. But since this is ultimately impossible within the creation, when you go deeper than the surface level of being and start to travel the path of a seeker and wish to know yourself entirely, those things which you have chosen as not of yourself start to reveal themselves. The shadows of the mountain that were not hit with the sun begin to appear around the climax of the mountain. You see crags and pinnacles arising out of the darkness around you, and you say, what is this that has appeared at my side? It is not part of me. But lo, you go deeper into the mountain, and you realize that each of these rocks and crevices are part of the same mountain. They are part of the self. The snows fall on the entirety of the mountain alike. I'd like to pause here. The thing that stands out to me the most is, we've talked about the reality of those parts of ourselves that we reject. The reason that we can be sure that they exist regardless of our approval is because we know that separation is ultimately impossible, that ultimately all is self. So there's nothing that we can observe that isn't ourself. And that often leads to a lot of real deep confusion because there's a lot of hard things to observe in this world. There's a lot of difficult things to observe in ourselves and in others. The world and reality and human nature can go dark. It can be very difficult. And it's easy to want to say, that's too dark. that's too negative. There are lots of things that I can think of in this world that are horrible. And yet, we are confronted with the responsibility as seekers to recognize ourselves in all of it. That's the only basis upon which we could ever forgive it, is if it had if it was retrievable as something that was nevertheless us and worthy. And so we perceive ourselves as real, and we are in a process of perceiving those things that we don't see as real as nevertheless having some reality, having some having the right to exist regardless of our own approval, right?
Mm-hmm. I like the consistent use of the light and shadow metaphor throughout these sessions. And I think of, exceptionally positive individuals who really shine light, and but they're almost overly positive, and there is no recognition of the shadows. You can tell when somebody has not done that shadow work. You can read it. And but I do enjoy. It's a good for me whenever I come across one. It's a reminder to like go, oh yeah, we are the mountain that's covered with snow. We are not just that part that's shined with the light. Like remember those shadowy parts. That is still a part of the mountain, even though the light isn't shining there. So it's up to us to recognize it, incorporate it, accept it, whatever it is, work through it.
It comes up a lot in conversations with seekers. The way in which what makes our path a little bit unique compared to other spiritual paths is our complete acceptance of the dark along with the light, and how this makes it a lot more difficult to think ourselves into a place where we're right and others are wrong. To give ourselves, as the Buddhists say, ground under our feet, when our position is fundamentally groundless until we have found the self and integrated the self. At the end of the day, if we're still in the process of doing that, we are still floating in midair, and there is nothing to hold on to in the illusion that isn't illusory except that fundamental truth. There is a lot of talk in the working group about the ways in which spiritual bypassing tends to convince people that, spirituality is about only emphasizing the good and only focusing on things. And like, if people have negative thoughts, if they're angry or anything like that, oh, that must be a problem. I can't, that disqualifies them from being spiritual. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think it's just, in fact, like the more you walk it and the more you see the things that you've rejected, the more you have to really wrestle with the fact that you have rejected these parts and that they are a part of you. And that can be very angering. That can be, I sometimes get angry at how distorted I am,
This might feel like a tangent, but I'm sure you saw Lord of the Rings in the Fellowship of the Ring. And when Frodo comes up against that elf queen and she sees that ring of power and she goes into like a beast mode for a hot minute, Yeah. And I love that scene because her character is just this divine, feminine, like powerful, nurturing, beautiful character. And then all of a sudden she goes dark, and it's that juxtaposition of the complete chaos and destruction that women are capable of. But on the opposite side of that coin, that beauty and that life generating nurture, but it is a balance. That's why it's that love and nurturing is so powerful, because you understand what she is capable of on the other side if she hasn't made the choice to, I don't know, be balanced or whatever it is. What is possible. And the same thing is there for men, with the things that men have done throughout history. There's a balance there, and there's so much power about, again, that bright side of the mountain, of choosing to express that love and that lightness, but understanding and having incorporated and maybe controlling or choosing not to follow that path of shadow and darkness.
Yeah, it's like it really stood out to me when you brought up that scene with Galadriel. She was really wrestling with what it would mean to give in to the negative desires that were inside of her. All that she had imagined before. This is something that she had considered. And I think that's really good. I think in fact, one of the things we were talking about the other day in the working group about working with catalysts and balancing is how useful it can be to just put yourself completely use your imagination to put yourself in a situation where it's completely negative, where things are as bad as you fear they might be, and to just completely immerse yourself in that and work it out in your head. And even if you go to some dark places, the very fact that you've actually worked it out in your head shows you things about it that if you're just avoiding it out of fear, if you don't even want to think that thing, if you don't even want to consider it about yourself, you will always be afraid to feel that way. Mm-hmm. In fact, one of the things that I remarked after his presentation was that it seems like a lot of the balancing techniques are about allowing ourselves to feel things that we're afraid to feel. We think it's about the situation that makes us feel that way, that we're avoiding the situation. But actually, we're avoiding the feeling. And the situation is only the proximate means by which we think we're going to encounter or avoid it. So in the fact that you actually grapple with it in your imagination, you can often become comfortable in feeling things that are not pleasant. And then they don't have to be threats, right? Because we're all capable of dealing with things that are uncomfortable and unpleasant. We do it all the time. There are just certain things that we build up in our head. And often if we engage with them directly and think about and engage with the feeling, we can, the situation that we're avoiding loses its potency. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm.
Let's continue. I know I can chatter all day.
Yeah. The one known as L2 spoke earlier about needing to love the self in order to love that which is perceived as other self. This is a concept that has been spoken of in many terms in your culture. One must love self before loving others. It holds especially true when one looks at it in this context, for that which is perceived as other self is also the self. And when one loves the self fully, that love trickles down deeper and deeper into the roots of self, where one perceives that love then is spread out to those things one thought of as other selves, which are actually also part of the same self. As the seeker penetrates deeper along what was earlier described as the vertical, that which is seemingly far away becomes nearer. Again, we use the illustration of a mountain to carry our point. Starting at the pinnacle of the mountain, one can look out at the points of other mountains in a mountain range. Perhaps from this perspective, there are clouds between the mountains, so that one standing on the peak of a mountain can see other mountains and clouds between the mountains and think of the mountain the seeker is standing on as one mountain and that mountain in the distance as a different mountain. But one penetrating deeper and deeper into the roots of self connects all other selves, and the distance between one mountain and the other mountain seems less of a separation and more of a continuity with all of the other mountains in the range. Again, to circle back to the concept of love and apply that to this illustration, the seeker brings the love down with him or herself into the roots of self, loving the self deeper and deeper in its entirety. And when one reaches the base of the mountain below the clouds and sees the connection with all the other mountains, that love spreads and grows to all the other mountains until it encompasses the entirety of the planet, shall we say, if we may use that image as a metaphor for all creation. I think this is a great example of the kind of root-based channeling that the spiritual path involves. When we bring that love down into the deep parts of ourselves, we are bringing something that is not necessarily of the third density experience into the third density experience and validating it, connecting with it, seeing what it actually is instead of what we are afraid that it is. And it's a way of introducing the creator to all of this nuance and depth and darkness inside of ourselves and retrieving it, laying claim to it, and recognizing that in many cases, those things that are dark about ourselves, that seem negative about ourselves, are actually our friends. And, one of the things that Carla has said in the past, and Kuo has said in the past, is that what we think of as like evil or negative or mean or oppositional in ourselves is often our power. It's our power that we have not reckoned with and taken responsibility for. And if we can love those parts of ourselves that seem unlovable and ask for it to work with us instead of holding itself against us, then we often find that we can use those negative parts of ourselves for power, and that we can push them towards positive ends. Once they are not oppositional any longer, once they have been accepted, they don't have to confuse us anymore. And we have access to their truth, because there is truth in the dark parts of ourselves that we reject. Those are parts of ourselves that have reality and they cannot be permanently separated from us. So they must have something that we can draw upon on our seeking. And I think that on the service to others path, it is that acceptance of the full self that allows us to engage all of these parts and draw upon their full power. And power is very dangerous. It's similar to what you were saying about Galadriel and women and men, about the very things that make them positive are just one point in the spectrum of that quality. And that the more that we can draw upon the full spectrum, the more we have the freedom to create and to express ourselves as needed without having to like shy away or hide.
For
right?
so many people, that the dark side of ourselves is accessed, unfortunately, via pressure valve when the positive side of our lives is not going very well. And we don't have free movement between the sides of ourselves because we have no practice. For some people, there's no recognition. Oh, I don't get mad. I don't do this. And then all of a sudden, it's like, wow, you're exploding. Like, you must be under stress. You got to take the first step of recognition.
In a lot of cases, I found my temper expressing itself more once I started walking the path and less. But it's very punctuated, right? It catches me off guard. That's what I find, is that it's more off guard and less me doing it because this is the way my personality is. It's more like, wow, I just flicked that guy off. Like, that came out of nowhere.
that was a like a knee jerk reaction with the doctor.
Knee jerk, absolutely. And it's me. It's just because I can't claim that I quote unquote caused it. It's still me. Mm-hmm. It's still something that I need to grapple with and accept and integrate into myself. And we can always keep in mind that when we do this, we're practicing how to love others. That's one point that they make here, that it is the love of these parts of ourselves that seem irretrievable and unreconcilable. It's in learning how to do that we learn how to love and accept and have patience for others, and to never give up on them, because we never give up on ourselves.
Have you ever been driving and like someone cuts you off or whatever, and you're like, oh my gosh, but then you pull up next to him and you realize it's your neighbor, or it's like your friend, oh,
absolutely.
Oh my gosh, they're going to work. They must be really late because they were due at work 10 minutes ago. I now have this experience every time my wife starts to get passive aggressive about a driver who's just acting a fool. I'm like, honey, like, we're headed to daycare to pick up our kids. What if this person is a person that we are going to see in the parking lot? Like, what if this is one of our friends and we just, we don't recognize them? I try to feel that way. Well, this has now become a habit. Like, anytime traffic is getting aggressive, I'm reminded that not just, oh, this is my friend, this is my neighbor, but this person has a story. This person might be going through something, might be late for work. They might be headed to the hospital. It's like, who knows? Or they might just be young and irresponsible, and that they're going to get in a couple accidents and they'll learn. Just hopefully it won't be me. But I try to, it's a good exercise. It's a good exercise to ask yourself when you're getting mad at traffic, hey, how would I react to this if this was my neighbor?
Traffic provides so many opportunities for a very primary elemental kind of catalyst, does it not?
Mm-hmm.
It's very episodic situations, right? Like they dissolve very quickly, but they can show you very intense things.
Yes, they do. It's high stakes.
And then you forget them in a moment.
You do.
Like it's, but if you pay attention to them, and I've done that before, like it almost makes driving this like far more complicated thing, right? Because
it's a spiritual exercise. Every time you get in the car, it's you turn the ignition, you turn on the spirituality, you know?
I will pretty much insist on that going forward. And so we go forward. There's only one other thing that this instrument mentions, that Kuo mentions through them. They say the one known as Carla spoke earlier of feeling a pain so intense that she may as well encompass that pain of the rest of humanity and heal all others' pain. She used the tool of her own suffering to penetrate the roots of herself so that she could see a connection with the entirety of other selves. In this instance, she was given the gift of oneness, connection between self and all other selves. It is often when confronted with these monsters, whether they be pain, bad dreams, or the monsters under the bed, that we are given the opportunity to go beneath the surface self, deeper into the one being that one sees in the mirror, to the one being at the center of creation. And this is a really important point that I want to emphasize. It's something I've brought up before, but we are united just as much by pain as we are by pleasure. Like, we all have pain that we're bringing around, and that can be a way, tapping into that pain can unite us. It doesn't need to be something that we mobilize into opposition and defense and driving each other apart. Actually, our pain in many cases unites us because it is something we all have in common. We all feel it at different levels. We all feel it in different like varieties, but it is a human experience. And especially in Buddhism, there's this idea of Tonglen, which is doing meditations that basically visualize yourself breathing in all of the pain and suffering of, first of all, yourself, then maybe others that you care about, then extending to maybe your town, to the planet, to the universe. But at these different levels, you are bringing in suffering and pain and negativity, and you're exhaling coolness and love and relief.
Interesting.
And so you're almost acting like this spiritual filter. And I've worked with this, and it's very, very powerful. It opens you up to a certain kind of compassion that's very, very alluring.
Interesting.
And it seems like it's very... It allows you to face things on an abstract level that maybe you can't face on a concrete. But you start to work with like how common all of this suffering is, how it's not just about you and it doesn't isolate you. I remember reading Pema Chodron talking about this technique where she talked about AIDS patients who are suffering and dying, who said their suffering finally has meaning to them because they can use it to connect to the world and to open their hearts in compassion because they realize that it's not just their suffering. It's everybody's suffering. Yeah. It's all connected. It's not just some like weird thing or like punishment happening to you.
This is why group therapy has shown to work because
that's a great point.
You recognize the pain in others and that they're going through what you're going through. This is a shared experience and you're working through it together.
It does not need to isolate you. That's for dang sure. Okay, let's move on. Kuo says, we would like to draw attention to the fact that within the one creation that connects us all, there have been created many different levels. Beings have stepped themselves down through various levels in order to gain all the experiences of life. There are fragments of the Creator, in essence, of yourself that are operating on different frequencies on different stairs of the staircase. These stairs all lead to one point, and yet one may find that they can move amongst the stairs and that various fragments from higher steps on the stairs may journey down into a vibration so different from that which you are familiar that you are often not capable of recognizing these fragments as your fellow creation in this current density. There are parts of yourself that are so distanced from yourself that they could, in the terms that you know, be considered a separate entity. And it is possible for these entities of different vibration to interact, to mingle with your vibration on a level that differs from the resistance put up by the immediate subconscious of an individual. The possibility of negative entities that have throughout the eons been deemed as demons, as monsters, exist on various levels of existence and are capable of interacting with individuals in this density on a level that can be fully disturbing and very distracting. So here we start to get into how the things that we reject and see as other than ourselves partake of all of these different levels or pieces of this deep self that I've been talking about, so that we're engaging it on multiple levels, not all of which we have available to us in our waking consciousness, and that is part of the otherness that we perceive. It's not the reality of it. The reality is that itself, but it is just the fact that we participate in a larger self. And this negative encounter is part of that participatory nature of the waking self in a larger creation, in a larger self.
Yeah, no comment.
If there are encounters with actually negative entities that are actually not part of ourself in the way that we normally think, they often have ingress through these unresolved, unaccepted parts of ourselves. And we'll go into more detail about that as we go on. Kuo continues, if we may liken the creation as a body, if one part of the body is hurt or experiencing flux, all of the attention of the body is drawn to that area experiencing that particular distortion. All concentration is put on said area. This is what happens when one entertains the fear in one's own heart, when one does not clear the levels of the immediate self in order to open the heart. They then draw forth like attention. If you constantly think about the things that you fear, the things that you dread, if you constantly worry that you will encounter resistance, it will come. This is your inner creator at work, the creator that does not know such infinite power and yet has the very real ability to create the emotions on which you fixate your mind. That being who continuously brings focus upon outside fears without first tending to his own heart is creating the call of all those fears to be manifest. So here we're talking about the power that we have that's rooted in our attention and the attention that we give to things. We magnify and reify them through the act of giving them attention. And that is a creative choice that we make. It's a way in which our perception creates our reality, right?
I'm thinking of what is the difference between, we all have interacted with somebody who seems to be not themselves when they're angry or when they're dealing with something. But what is the difference between, as an individual, the way that you act when you have not dealt with this darker part of yourself, or you have not dealt with these challenges, versus the person who has, in this metaphor, if one part of the body is hurt or experiencing flux, all of the attention of the body is drawn to the area experiencing that particular distortion. All concentration is put upon said area. What is the difference in that scenario between the person who has that unresolved darkness within them and someone who has really incorporated,
Yeah, this is something I didn't really understand until I read it this time right now. I think this is what they mean by these different levels of self and these different, one way of understanding that is the different sub-densities of consciousness within third density. And in other ways, understanding the densities that are outside of third density. These are all levels of reality that impinge upon us, that interact with us. Just because we don't have waking access to fourth or fifth or sixth density doesn't mean the lessons of those densities aren't available and working with our lessons. So I see also the different levels as corresponding to the different energy centers or chakras. I do see a little bit of equivalence between thinking of the different densities from where you stand in third density and thinking of the different chakras from where you stand in third density.
Okay.
They're kind of your access to the totality of experience and consciousness. And I think one way of understanding what you're asking is we have blockages at different levels.
That's a good reminder.
These blockages that manifest based on where we put our attention. If we put our attention on a negative perception that's created by a blockage, we exacerbate and enlarge that in our lives, in our mental space, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a good reminder.
And so, yeah, and Kuo will tell us what the opposite of that is, how to deal with that otherwise.
Okay.
So they say right after that, when you open the heart and send out the call of love, you will find that not only are you met with a love response, but that love penetrates the darkness that you so fear, that it creates ripples in the pond that go farther than most in this density are even capable of imagining. So this also reinforces the idea that it is work on the energy centers that can help us transcend these levels and to bring them into the self and to recover them. But it has to do with a faithful opening of the heart and being willing to, one, love those things that present as so horrible, and two, be willing to feel what they want you to feel. To have the knowledge that you will not be lost because you feel something. That's what we're afraid of. Pema Chodron says it perfect. She says that, all of this like avoidance and fear of others and of the dark parts of ourself arise, I'm paraphrasing here, because we fear they'll trigger a confusion in us that we cannot abide. Like if I see something horrible in the news that just beggars my ability to imagine it's so negative, that thing is not happening to me. But I am afraid at what it means for my own concept of the goodness and unity of all creation. It shakes my faith in the story that I tell myself about what my life is about, that it is a spiritual evolutionary path. Coming to terms with the feelings of these things allows us to recover the fact that even though it presents as unpleasant, it is still fundamentally part of the Creator, and I can handle it. Mm-hmm. I will not be completely thrown off guard and blown away by it.
Yes.
And that builds a confidence in yourself to be able to serve in these dark places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Continuing. As the seeker moves into these areas of opposition, confusion, and difficulty, there is often the temptation either to cease the journey or to become disheartened and feel a failure. These are normal responses, my friends. There is no shame in feeling them, but there is a portion of your tempering, shall we say, as a spiritual vessel, which seeks to hold the highest vibrations and to reflect these vibrations to the creation about you, for you interact with all that there is. And how you interact is a product of your own choosing. Eventually, each seeker will find that there is a great benefit to the self in sharing heartfelt love with each portion of the creation, including those portions that seem negative in relation to the self, especially in the interaction with the self. Yet to share the open heart and the unconditional love that is found therein with the negatively oriented entities is but half the journey that needs to be taken to find respite and relief. The other half, we would suggest, is to build that armor of light about yourself with as much fervor as the love that has been sent from the heart. For this armor of light is that which provides a safe haven for the self that has encountered the difficulty from without. For though it can be said that there is an entire universe contained within the self that has both the positive and the negative experiences and entities, yet as it has been said, as above, so below, as within, so without. When this armor of light has been constructed, then the seeker that desires to be free of the opposition of negative sources is so, both from within and without, as is the intention of the seeker. I probably should have stopped sooner, but the idea is that, I'm trying to get through this because I know time is of essence. This speaks very much to what I've just been dealing with. I moved into an area in my life of opposition, confusion, and difficulty, and I had the temptation to just give up and stop worrying about doing these meditations that put me face to face with these things. Mm-hmm. And I think there's also the metaphor of tempering. If you'll recall, I think it was in one of our previous episodes, I talked about that Hatan session that said, we give you the vision of the hammer hitting the rock on the anvil. That which is not tempered will break. And experience, dealing with catalyst and integrating it and transforming in response, that is what tempers us as spiritual vessels for the Creator's love and light, to be able to endure these things that are tough and to broadcast love even when it seems like all that we're being met with is hate or negativity. It's strength. We are getting stronger through all of this, and the strength is going to be used to express our deepest truth in future densities. And what we're learning here is how to do that even when we're not sure that we're doing it, or we're not sure we're doing it well or correctly.
I like that reminder of the hammer, the rock, and the anvil. And that which is not tempered will break.
Yeah.
So that question is, well, how do I become tempered? But I suppose that's what we're all going through. That's life.
Unfortunately, you're already in the middle of it. Oh, and also fortunately, right?
Yeah, true. True.
Yeah. And again, just a reminder that perception creates the subject-object dichotomy that gives a drama to these things that are ultimately just concepts within the Creator that we are. So when we engage in this drama, the more that we can see it as a drama that is contrived by our own distortions. And therefore, the love that we're giving is both to ourselves and to that other. And that otherness and that selfness is two dynamics of the same fundamental thing.
Yeah, and that's a great reminder that remember that we don't see the world the way it is. We see the world the way we are. And you have to, there has to be a little generosity when you're having conflict with others or with yourself, that what you're feeling is not quote unquote real. It is your perception and all of this, the story that you tell yourself around that perception. So whatever exercises, whatever tools are available so that you can work through what it is you need to work through, but recognize it's all you.
Yeah.
It always in and forever is you. That's hard to swallow. That's hard.
Yeah. The Buddhists talk about the wisdom of no escape and how we think that we have the ability to walk away from these pieces and reject these things, and that matters in the long run. But it's just creating the wisdom comes from recognizing that there is no escape from these things, that they're part of ourselves, that they're as near to us as our breath, and therefore we fool ourselves when we think that we can reject and pick and choose which parts we identify with and which we don't.
Sure.
So let's go into the last part where they talk about two ways to kind of deal with this, and then we'll be able to wrap up.
Okay.
Kuo says, perhaps you have noticed, my friends, that as the various instruments in this circle have spoken, they have often repeated these words, love and light. As you walk the tightrope across the abyss of chaos, which is all that is perceived in this distortion, there is a balance beam for each self that is love and light. As entities pursue the spiritual path, they begin to discover that there are many points from which to perceive. Rare indeed is the seeker who is able to ascend the staircase of various vibratory ranges from which perception proceeds, all of which are couched and nested within your web of perception, which is more or less integrated into a waking personality. Just want to point out, again, they're talking about different vibratory levels of this staircase, and that conforms to the chakras, that conforms to the densities, and it shows that perception as a creative act is rooted in where our consciousness is in our system. And that a lot of what I think adepthood involves, walking the spiritual path involves, is learning how to change your perception, change your point of view, change your perspective so that you can see bigger or smaller parts of the Creator that put it in a different light, that give you a different appreciation of how one thing connects to another thing. And remember, we always talk about how the biggest lesson the Confederation tries to teach us is the variability of perspective, and how by changing our perspective, we can change the reality that we are perceiving at the moment.
Yeah.
Kuo continues, one may discover that one falls from one step down many steps to another floor of perception entirely. Another may find that there are sudden lifts and drops within dreams. Others may find that the vision is so dearly desired that is realer than the day-to-day illusion becomes less penetrable as one moves closer to it. All of these are examples of what the essences and energies and entities that seem to block your path are. It is a great challenge to see yourself as more than a waking personality, to realize that your boundaries are not those of your personality or your understanding. It is not necessarily helpful or good news to the seeking entity to find that there is not necessarily a continuity in a horizontal sense to one's point of perception. So we're connecting back with the earlier parts of this session and the idea that these different levels of vibratory selfhood integrate with those things that we accept and reject. And what we're dealing with is that all these things come together to give us a variety of experiences, a variety of feelings and emotions and senses of self, some of which are more alien than others, some of which are more familiar than others. And this is part of walking the path, is that the vertical, although we think we're going in the straight line horizontally, there actually is terrain.
Yes.
It is terrain that we don't see clearly. And so we are bound to be surprised by it.
Yeah, it's hard to see the next peak over when you're in the bottom of a valley. You know?
Yeah. We have to kind of have faith in our greater, larger, deeper self, that we have the resources to deal with whatever the terrain presents us, even if as our waking self, we are frightened, we are scared, and we think, I can't possibly handle that. Ra and Kuo and other Confederation contexts make a point of reinforcing over and over again that we will not present ourselves with anything that we can't handle. The very fact that we are encountering it means that our desire at some level of this vibratory, these different vibratory levels of self, that desire manifested from one of those levels. And it's a real level that's part of ourself. We would not be experiencing it, and we certainly wouldn't even be experiencing it as catalysis in the first place if it didn't belong to us.
Yes.
If it wasn't part of us.
Yes.
And that's what they mean, I think, by this continuity. There's a continuity to the positive and the negative. It's all connected to the same self. So then we get into how can we deal with these things? So Kuo continues. The second part of the query is how may we deal with these distractions, essences, and entities that stand before the seeking self and say, go no further? It is far easier to answer, for we call upon the principle of unity. And we would ask each, when faced with such visions, essences, entities, and distractions, to cease movement, just as one in deep water might cease thrashing about, attempting to swim to a shore that cannot be seen, and to come to rest, floating, gently being borne by whatever current one is experiencing in terms of types of vibration, when the effort to extract oneself from the moment of challenge has ceased, when one is empty and unresisting, one may then be in touch with the love that is within that vibration, within that moment, within that nexus. This is very similar, I think, to a lot of the messages that Kuo has given our circle, in the sense that they've often emphasized the importance of rest on the path, that we push forward and we attempt with a certain kind of ambition to address our imbalances, to bring balance to them, to address our distortions, to see the love in them, and to work with all this material. But it can be overwhelming at times. There is wisdom in stopping the work and the ambition to engage directly and enthusiastically with it. And that this can be taken to the other extreme, as I have in my life, where you sort of shrink back and you don't want to deal with anything at all. And that is going the other extreme. They seem to me to be charting out this middle path where we allow ourselves to take a break, and that then we put ourselves back to work in dealing with integrating the full self.
Yeah, because it's hard. It's work. Sometimes you need a break, you know.
we can't fool ourselves and think that this is all rainbows and unicorns. If there's one thing the law of one is about, it's that it's not all rainbows and unicorns.
Yes.
Because the creator blinks neither at the light or the dark, we have a responsibility for engaging with all of it. And the way that we choose to engage with it is the way that we polarize.
Yes.
And we always get another opportunity. So if we didn't like the way we did it last time, don't worry.
You'll get another shot.
Yep.
Yeah.
This is important in two ways, Kuo continues. Firstly, seekers are possessed with minds. And often the functions of the mind are denigrated in comparison to the forces of intuition and knowing. Yet in a situation which confronts one as a seeker, when the resistance to the resistance has ceased, when there is peace within the perceiving self, even in the face of this challenge, one may, using one's mind, ask to find the love in the moment. One may even use this question as a mantra. One may, in one's own way, create the desire to know where is the love in the moment. One has stopped the momentum of that which is fearsome. One has come to a halt. One is therefore able to originate a new momentum and create the desire to see the love in the vibration of that moment. This is really interesting because they're talking about how sometimes it's the very fact that we wrestle with it that makes it oppositional to begin with. And especially if our instinct, if our knee-jerk reaction to what is presented to us is to resist it, then you can see the usefulness of giving yourself a break and just sitting with it. And I feel, and once again, I think it has a lot to do with getting used to these feelings and not seeing a feeling that we call bad as meaning that something is bad,
yes.
right?
Yes.
Like feelings are allowed to be painful. They're allowed to be dark and hard to deal with. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with us on a fundamental level.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
And I think that is a capacity that we are all working on, is to be able to abide these feelings so that when they occur, they don't throw us. We can deal with them and we can be there for other people when they are thrown by them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, final part. Secondly, it is the glory and the truth of each seeker that the love in the moment is himself. To open the self admits the challenge to the awareness of love is to open the self to the universe that is love. It is not through an act of will that one becomes able to offer love to a fearsome entity that one is seeing, or to an attitude of mind that burns with a hectic fire, keeping him from the peace he can taste and feel. There is a releasing of all levels of perception that comes to one who desires to know the self. At the point where that question becomes a point of entry, then that seeker may allow love to flood the self so that one is marinated in love, drenched, permeated, and filled with love. And as one feels the self as love, from this point of perception, it becomes the act of simplicity itself to love the unlovable, to embrace the wolf that bites. Okay, so what are they saying here? I think they are explicitly saying that it is in allowing ourselves to integrate these things at multiple levels, in fact, chakra work, to give ourselves opportunities for different levels of perceiving this, and therefore to allow for different capacities of self, namely the love that we all have, to be offered to these things, even though as a red ray issue or as an orange ray issue or as a yellow ray issue, we have a hard time with it. We can allow these other levels, the green, blue, indigo, to permeate this. Even if we don't believe it fully, we can still open ourselves to the possibility. And now we're giving ourselves things to choose amongst. And we can choose to work with them from this perspective where it's all part of one thing. In other words, it's always this message of changing the perspective and thereby changing the reality that you have just created for yourself.
Change your perspective, change your reality.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it seems to me that it's only by opening your heart at the end of the day that it really gets through. That you have to have the courage. It is courage to face these things that you have built a personality around not facing.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. It's hard to put your ego in check.
Yeah.
And
these are structural. These rejections are load-bearing beams in the self that we have built. So when we take them out, they matter. They are not just things that we sweep away. They have to be engaged with, and we have to have new supports, new structures. And it is this new perception that gives us, I think, the inkling that it's possible. Because we can't really, because faith is a lot about mobilizing your resources towards an end that you can't necessarily see step by step how you get there.
Yeah.
You have faith, you set your orientation, you insist on seeing love, and then you do the hard work of step by step bringing yourself to that point. And you can rest, you can give up your resistance for a moment, you can give up your work for a moment and just feel it. And little by little, you open yourself up to a new level of yourself. And like I said, it scared you because it had power, that dark part of yourself. It's not because it's just bad. It has something that you need, but it also has something that scares you. So you are in a full integration with this possibility of self that you are newly creating. Continuing with Kuo, many are those who have at various times in their incarnation damaged their light bodies, or as this instrument would say, their energy bodies, and therefore have created those points of entry which are perforce unguarded. To work on this aspect of the challenges of entities and essences, which seem to be a roadblock or a point of fear or of distraction, is to call upon a certain kind of help. Can you imagine, my friends, the uncounted entities who have never left the love and the light of the one infinite creator to enter into illusion? Many call them angels or the Elohim. Whatever their title, they function as part of the creative principle, and they are able, when asked, to enter into the healing of light bodies. Therefore, we ask each in times of challenge to call upon that help, and then to know that healing is taking place. Okay, so only at the very end of this session do we even get into actual instances of psychic or negative greeting from actual negative entities. And all they are saying is that these points of ingress that they exploit are ours. They are things that they are features of ourself. They are not inevitable, but they are real things that, because of the decisions and the place from consciousness that we might be coming in a given moment, they are the fact. They're the terrain that we're dealing with right now, right? Ask for help. This is where prayer comes in. This is where faith and building that faith through reaching out to the resources that you are over time practicing connecting with. You can call them angels, Elohim, cherubs. I don't know. There's lots. I just think of it as the goodness of the Creator at my fingertips. If only I should ask for it. It is so easy to go through life and think that you have to handle everything yourself. You have friends, you have family, you have colleagues and fellow seekers, but you also have those that you don't see. And this is the same body that has the flaws and the vulnerabilities also has this capacity to reach to greater pieces of itself, to greater things that seem outside itself, but actually are intimately part.
Yes.
And so we're learning to work with all of this. Okay, therefore we ask in times of challenge to call upon that help, and then to know that healing is taking place. Offer those moments as a daily practice, asking for the help and giving gratitude for the help. This is very important too. Practicing the idea, the impulse to even ask for help can be a challenge. It's something I've struggled with too. Doing it every day during your morning offering or your morning meditation is a good time. And I make a point of it now in my ritual to ask the Creator for help. And I visualize myself not just receiving relief from the Creator, but also I place my hands up and I visualize myself taking all of my worries and fears and concerns and giving it to the Creator. The Creator can handle it. I may not be able to handle it. And in my heart of hearts, being honest with myself, I may not be able to handle it, but the Creator can, and I have faith in that. And I work with building that faith every day. And it does show results, because I can tell that it allows me to address those fears and things from a different point of view, that change in perception. And I think that's crucial, to recognize that the consciousness that we occupy, that is the wholeness that our waking consciousness is only part of, has all of these resources. We just need to open up to them. We need to open up to the nearness of them.
Yeah. Try to lift yourself up to that higher perspective.
Try to lift yourself up and then recognize that you may not be able to do it all on your own and that you need help. But this help comes from just a higher level of what's your own. It is your own, but you're opening up to greater and greater capacities that don't seem near at hand, right?
Yeah.
Although the creator is that which is mysterious, beyond all telling, Kuo says, its essence is love, and its interacting parts are all made of love. Let this be the basis of your approach to those times of challenge and resistance that you shall indeed meet again and again, whoever you are, whatever your path. It is a natural part of movement through the density of choice, the density of dynamic opposition. Only within yourself, girded with faith that all is well, can you open yourself to love. And that's where we're going to leave it. This opening to love seems to be a huge part of their suggestions here that maybe I didn't appreciate as much before when I read this. But it seems to me that it's consonant with the frequent admonition that we are working with our heart chakras and the possibilities or the lessons that will be used in fourth density when we open our hearts in third density, behind the veil, when we can't see the connectedness of all the mountains under the clouds, right? When the veil is lifted, we'll be able to, all the clouds will lift and it will be obvious to us. And yet it will be so obvious that we won't have the motivation that we have now to use that desire to push us through these dark parts and to build the power in the tempering that will make us better instruments for the Creator going forward.
Amen. This is a good session.
Yeah.
This was a good session. Good choice.
And I think it's also great because negative greeting often comes up for people. I just want to say again, the reason I often avoid this topic is because sometimes seekers use negative greeting as a synonym for something bad happening to me. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me like, okay, if everything bad happens to you is because of something outside of yourself, I think that tends to be a very poor way to work with the concept. It doesn't take any responsibility. So the more that we can connect with those things that seem alien and other and bring them into the self, even when they're painful, and then let our hearts can do a lot of the work of this reconciliation and this integration. If we start the process of opening, if we make the choice to open, it's not through an act of will. Where did they say this before? It is not, as Kuo says, it is not through an act of will that one becomes able to offer love to a fearsome entity that one is seeing, or to an attitude of mind that burns with hectic fire. There is a release. It's not that you're making yourself love. It's that you're releasing the judgment that prevents you from expressing the love you already have. Mm-hmm. Your awareness of the love that already connects you. It's less about doing and more about being.
I like that.
Yeah.
More about being.
It's the lesson, and this is something Kuo and the Confederation talk about a lot. The service of being versus the service of doing.
Yes.
And the way in which action is misunderstood in our lives from a spiritual point of view. It seems to be that action is the only thing that makes things happen. But when you open up to the idea that you are greater than simply the waking consciousness that has seeming agency, you start to understand that it is through a cooperation with greater parts of yourself and an opening up to how much you don't understand that you engage your full self in the meat of Catalyst.
Hear, hear.
Well, that's the end of our session, and I think it's probably a good place to wrap things up.
I think
you got anything you want to wrap up with?
No, it's plenty of stuff to chew on, per usual, and plenty of stuff that what good is learning something if you don't try to apply it, you know? So right. I'm just trying to pull out a couple of gems and just let them simmer today as I go through the day and, see if there's a way I can incorporate some of these ideas.
It's something I'm struggling with too, because I don't usually think of my life and its difficulties in terms of this otherness natively. Mm-hmm. And yet sometimes I think the idea of negative greeting and like a negative intrusion into your otherwise homeostatic life is a useful model. Because sometimes things don't seem like the self, and no amount of willing yourself or tricking yourself or talking yourself into it will make it more the self. Mm-hmm. I think that the deeper practice is in this opening of the heart that they keep mentioning in this practice. That this opening of the heart, instead of like grabbing the negativity and then like pushing it into yourself, like, just like shoving it right into your heart, by opening your heart and letting it come in, letting that vulnerability and that receptiveness guide you. That to me seems like a key skill here that they are emphasizing.
Well, again, thank you for another great discussion and a great review.
Thank you. I'm glad that you're feeling better.
Me too.
I'm glad that I'm feeling better.
Heck yeah.
And I hope we'll, we're going to the holidays, so I don't expect that we'll have the best schedule, but let's just keep in touch and we'll do it when we can.
Yes.
Listeners, like, we try to keep a schedule, but at the end of the day, it'll show up in your feed when it shows up.
Yes. We're doing the best we can.
We are. So in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Continue to give us any feedback that you have, and stay in the love and light.